I have a black armband with me today. Looks like this, just a few inches wide, no markings, no words, nothing on it at all. So no way this could get kids expelled from school, right? Right? So the story behind that unassuming armband that I showed you a moment ago starts back in the 1960s, when America's involvement in the Vietnam War was really starting to increase. The war was becoming hugely unpopular, and American sentiment started turning against continued involvement. And the draft, which was already causing unrest, increased from 17,000 to 35,000 per month in July of 1965, which only made things worse. As the war dragged on, there were more and more protests being planned and taking place across the country. And it was one protest in particular that involved just a few students that we're still talking about 60 years later. The protest I'm referring to was carried out in December of 1965 by the Tinker family, pictured here, living in Des Moines, Iowa. So the plan for the protest was for students to wear a black armband, just like this one, showing that they were mourning the dead of the Vietnam War, which is pretty tame as far as protests go. Moreover, there was only going to be less than 10 students wearing these armbands in a school district of 18,000 students. So surely the school district had more important things to worry about than less than 10 students wearing a black armband to school, right? So anyways, the school district calls an emergency meeting and passes the following policy, which prohibits students from wearing an armband. Any student wearing an armband would be asked to remove the armband, and if he refused, he would be suspended until he returned without the armband. When asked about the reasoning behind the ban, a district official responded that schools are no place for demonstrations, and that the ban was in alignment with another district policy that prohibited anything that is a disturbing situation within the school, which we all know is a lie given the state of cafeteria food in public schools. What? The school district's policy banning armbands was published in the newspaper, so the students knew before even going back that if they wore these armbands, there was a chance that they would be suspended or expelled. Nevertheless, some of them showed up to school with the armbands, they were expelled from school, and after a few days they decided to remove the armbands and return to school to finish out the remainder of the year. However, at the same time, they also filed a lawsuit claiming that their First Amendment rights to free speech had been violated. And so the battle began, with the constitutional protection for students' free speech in one corner and a school district's responsibility to prevent disruptions to the learning environment in the other. Now, had the students in this case decided that the best way to protest was to go get a megaphone and go into their math class and shout over their teachers for the entire hour, we probably wouldn't still be discussing this case today. But that's not what happened. Less than 10 students wore a black armband to school, hardly disruptive, but it raises a question of, well, where do we draw that line between a student's right to free speech and a school district's responsibility to provide a safe and conducive learning environment? On the one hand, schools absolutely have a requirement to educate students. In fact, it's the only social service I know of that we give a report card to and grade them on different metrics. So if schools didn't have the ability to, discipline students or restrict some of their behaviors or speech, well, it'd be pure pandemonium in the schools, and then we'd be complaining that, students aren't learning enough. On the other hand, schools are a unit of government. And so in any other context, if the government came out and said, you're not allowed to say this, you can't express this message, you can't have this opinion or view or belief, people would understandably be upset. So how is this okay just because it's in a school? Fortunately, there was another court case going on at the same time to help answer this question. In 1964, African-American students at the Booker T. Washington School in Mississippi wore this button advocating for civil rights. Similar to the situation in Des Moines, the principal deemed the buttons a disruption to the learning environment, banned them, and a lawsuit was filed. In 1966, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit made the final ruling and determined that a student's free speech rights could not be restricted unless it materially and substantially interferes with the requirements of appropriate discipline and the operation of the school. So thanks to this case, there was now a somewhat of a legal test for determining when a school district could restrict a student's free speech rights. But would it hold up in the Supreme Court? So 3 years after this case we were just talking about with the buttons was decided, the Supreme Court would finally hear the Tinker v. Des Moines case, and the arguments for both sides can be summed up as following. The Tinkers felt that the armbands were not at all disruptive, and when you only have less than 10 kids out of 18,000 wearing these black armbands, it's a pretty solid argument. And more importantly, that the policy banning armbands was not a ban on all political speech or messages in school. In fact, it was only banning the students protesting the Vietnam War. To demonstrate this, they pointed out that the district was still allowing students to wear political slogan pins, as well as the German Iron Cross, which had been a symbol of Nazi Germany not even 20 years ago. Even though the lower courts have decided with the school district up until this point, it feels like they have a bit of an uphill battle at this point, trying to explain how it is that students wearing the German Iron Cross was allowed in school, but a black armband was not. And these are the arguments that they made. First, the district disagreed that the armbands did not cause a disruption, and said that at least one math class got completely off track because students were talking about the armband. Secondly, they argued that schools should not have to wait until a disruption has been made before they can take action, saying that an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So the second point that the district argues here isn't entirely unreasonable. Keep in mind that the Tinkers' form of protest was a black armband mourning those who had perished in the war, which means that at this time there are already people who have lost family and loved ones to the Vietnam War. It's not unreasonable or unthinkable that someone, seeing a protest against the war that their family member perished in could get upset, could get aggravated, and maybe even lead to a fight. So, doesn't the district have some responsibility if they think that some form of speech or action could lead to a fight, that they should restrict it ahead of time? Apparently not. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in favor of the Tinkers and said that there had to be not just the fear of disruption, but an actual disruption taking place in the school to justify restricting a student's free speech. In their own words from the ruling, undifferentiated fear or apprehension of disturbance is not enough to overcome the right to freedom of expression. Any departure from absolute regimentation may cause trouble. Any variation from the majority's opinion may inspire fear. Any word spoken in class, in the lunchroom, or on campus that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. But our Constitution says we must take this risk. And our history says that it is this sort of hazardous freedom, this kind of openness, that is the basis of our national strength and the independence and vigor of Americans who grow up and live in this relatively permissive, often disputatious society. The court went on to say, in our system, state-operated schools may not be enclaves of totalitarianism. In our system, students may not be regarded as closed-circuit recipients of only that which the state chooses to communicate. So pretty powerful words of support from the Supreme Court in terms of student free speech in schools and this concept of a hazardous freedom that we should cultivate, and that students aren't just closed circuits to receive what the state wishes to communicate to them. They have their own thoughts, they have their own opinions, and that they should be able to express themselves even while they're in school. But on the other hand, my heart does go out to school administrators that, if they became aware of something a student was planning to say or do at school the next day that could cause a disruption and maybe even a safety concern, that, wouldn't we want them to take every action in their power to prevent anyone from getting harmed in schools? So let me know what you think in the comments down below. And if you like the content, would appreciate you subscribing. I've got more videos on the way. That's all today. Thanks.